Hello and welcome to the developer commentary of Industria. I am David Jungnickel, co-founder, writer and artist at Bleakmill.
And I'm Steve Chapman, co-founder, developer and level designer at Bleakmill. To listen to a commentary note, simply approach it and press use, and to stop listening, press use again or just walk away. Keep an eye out throughout the game as we have plenty of development insight from ourselves, the musician, sound designer and animators.
Industria took 5 years to complete and is the first game we ever made, and with that, a huge learning experience for everyone involved. From learning the actual tools like Unreal Engine, Blender and others, to team organization, hitting deadlines, level design, technicalities like optimization, writing, community management and maintaining a healthy work-life balance and so much more. While being imperfect and a major challenge for us and our closest people, Industria marks our entry into the industry and we could not be more proud of it. Thank you, the players, and the community for supporting us throughout the years. Enjoy the commentary.
In early builds of the game, the player started inside the office and close to the machine itself. We soon found this to be a major issue though, as players were just starting the game and straight away entering the tangent universe. This meant that before they'd even got used to controls and mechanics, they had likely already missed valuable information about the story. Where does the game start, and when does it start? And even more concerning, players may have just continued unaware of the fact that they'd even entered a new universe. We also realised we'd failed to build the tension and atmosphere that we'd envisioned, and our primary focus at this point was pacing. We added the entire exterior of the level after testing, and wanted to begin the game away from the machine, and so we placed Nora in her apartment at the start, allowing us to implement a calm beginning and ramp up the intensity as we move towards the office. This also gave us the room to mimic this concept using music, starting with mellow bursts at the apartment, and moving towards more frantic themes and sounds at the machine itself.
The GDR setting was always a pretty dominant aspect of Industria's theme. As I'm from Berlin and my childhood being littered with my country's history of the wall, East and West, it was important for me to get our settings authentic and unique. We gathered a lot of reference pictures online and through books. The apartment layout, as well as the stairwell, is very typical for the time and GDR architecture. The handheld blender, RG28, the dishes and the radio, fridge, desk, hand railings and windows, street lamps and carpets are directly modeled after photographs, creating an unusual environment for a video game, as the GDR setting was rarely shown in this medium. Looking into our studio's future, we see ourselves exploring more of this setting, as well as other specific settings and places, evoking a feeling of familiarity, just as our main reference Half-Life 2 did with City 17's design.
With the progressive flow of our pacing in mind, at this point we're starting to intensify the atmosphere. We start in this scene with the Stasi car speeding past us. This draws our attention as the only moving and audible object in the environment, and its movement from left to right pulls our attention naturally in that direction. By the time the car passes us, most players will have moved forward to look directly down the street and towards the office block. Here, the scene composition is crucial. As we gaze down the street and towards our goal, we use typical 80s era buildings to line the streets, and their bold geometric shapes confine our view and frame the office at the centre.
Hey, I'm Clemens, sound designer at Bleakmill. I joined the team at Bleakmill rather late, so I was always kind of behind in the process and had to design the sounds to stuff that was already there. This can be an easy task, but it also makes the chance very small to influence certain topics and ideas. In the office level, the very special thing are the shockwaves of the sender, almost being audible in every corner of the level. Heavily inspired by Playdead's Inside and their amazing shockwave scene, I created multiple variants of intensity of the shockwaves, ranging from deep and muffled impacts, which are mostly audible outside the facility, to intense crashes shaking the whole office interior. The shockwaves are a key factor of the level as they constantly remind the player of their goal, reaching the heart of the facility, the sender chamber, and to find out what's going on.
Hi, I'm Lucas, composer at Bleakmill. The music in this level has gone through some serious changes, just like the level design itself. Originally, there were a few unconnected pieces of music playing in various areas of the level. In the end, we went for a more interconnected approach. One track in a number of variants, split into special stems and loops to give the whole level a consistent feel of mystery, while also building up tension from apartment to sender. The track which plays here was actually composed for an abandoned shopping mall in the canal level, which sadly had to scrapped. I composed the song with the charm of an old mall in mind, still standing escalators, a glamorous building from a different time. As the shopping mall level was scrapped, the track moved to the office as the team already fell in love with its sparkling mystery vibe.
As this was the original start of the game, it was apparent that we were overloading players with information. Teaching the controls and mechanics in a confined space left little room for them to absorb additional information about the plot. We certainly fixed many of those problems by moving the game start outside the office, but we still had concerns with introducing Walter whilst not having him on screen. This is partly the reason for the phone call at the beginning, as we can introduce him before players take control and get distracted. Then we conceived the idea of Walter's office being isolated from the others, and added the locked door in between so that players would need Walter's keycard to progress. This straight away tells us a few things about Walter. Firstly, he's involved in the project, and secondly, he must be high-ranking if he holds the key to the offices beyond. We purposefully kept the first corridor simple with no other rooms aside from Walter's office, and by adding personal items like the photograph to his desk and having Nora call out to Walter, we ensure the player is now aware of the game's premise and Walter's importance to it. After that, we can focus on the rooms beyond the door and how the office and machine operate, with each room having a specific purpose. If players spend time to study it, they'll learn that goods come in from beyond the airlock, then they are studied by personnel. After that, the useful information is recorded and logged in the tape room, before then being stored in the storage room.
We wanted to create a sinister atmosphere, hinting at the facility's work pipeline through environmental storytelling. The observation chambers are part of bringing in material which arrived at the sender's central chamber. Objects like furniture from other timelines would arrive here under the desks and then put into chambers for possible decontamination. The scientists would carefully observe any obscure behavior of the material, with the past days written on top of the windows. Behind one of the windows, you can find a little reference to the only other game we made yet, a game jam entry called Jonathan's Whale. You can still find that on itch.io.
Hello, I'm Gabriel, and I'm the first-person weapon and cutscene animator at Bleakmill. My task was to reanimate all weapons with the experience I've gathered from working on various weapon reanimation mods for Left 4 Dead 2. When we implemented NVIDIA's ray tracing into Industria, we quickly saw an issue with our first-person models. The player would see the flying hands and attached weapons in reflective surfaces. This led to the idea of creating a full-body rig, which would also enable players to see Nora's legs when looking down, as well as more dramatic shadows in certain situations. Our character animator Ben made a start with a full-body rig, and I've set up the head camera for a first test with just the pistol. After Steve implemented everything, we realized the amount of work attached to those extra legs. Every interaction, like opening doors, grabbing an item, climbing ladders, or even just crouching, would need a complete rework. Questions like, but where does the ammo physically come from when reloading, and where do our holstered weapons go, emerged. We decided to abandon this path as development time was already tight. To fix the hovering hands and weapons and reflective surfaces, we simply excluded those objects from RTX.
The library, which we also call the super level. It's an abstract place at the end of each major level in the game. Whispering voices tell aware players backstories about the citizens of Horkovik and how they feel about certain events happening in their hometown. This level was really only made because of the theatre scenes, which follow directly after the library environments. The theatre scenes themselves were originally just simple cutscenes. However, we were unsatisfied with them being the only unplayable thing of Industria, so we made the theatre scenes playable. This was followed by us wanting to make players see and feel the library, the parallel world in which the theatres exist. One thing led to another, and suddenly we had a completely new environment complex.
Forests.
The music in the libraries kept rather abstract. I composed all library tracks with the difference between the normal and the parallel world in mind. The goal was a strong contrast to the other levels. As each library part stands for a certain part of the narrative, the music had to go through a change each time too. Going from rather mystery to light ambient sounds to dark and more threatening drones did a pretty good job. The theater music after each library part is always the same music track but altered with various filters to have a consistent music base while also differentiating between the two worlds.
Theatre acts as an abstract storytelling device at the end of each library part. The content of the play either preludes what's going to happen next, or it recaps what's already happened before, all during the time dilation. The idea was to create a simple theatre play with the main characters. Nora, for example, is portrayed as this constant hovering element, standing for her being essentially in stasis in the library. We wanted to give players the chance to walk by the show and not force them to watch the play. Looking back at it, this really just led to most players skipping the rooms, which led to losing momentum in the narrative. The theatre is another example of us adjusting the game's content to our skill level. We wanted to show actual human characters in the game, but knew that face-to-face conversations and close proximity would not be up to our standards. Facial modelling and animation, hair movement and eyes are all hard things to get right for us indies, without any experience in game making especially. Having human characters perform abstract plays at a distance the player can't physically reach was the perfect solution.
The Institute. This is the first room we made for Industria in January 2017. Back then we had no name yet, and the game was a lot darker and very different in genre. I remember visiting Steve in Wales to block out the first few rooms. Back then, we would have never thought we'd make it that far.
As a Resi-inspired third person, the game featured fixed cameras and typical survival horror tropes from that mid-90s era of game. As our skills and capabilities evolved though, so too did Industria, which grew into a narrative first-person shooter much more in the vein of Half-Life 2. In the images, you can see what the first prototype looked like, and while very technically different, the general shapes of the room are at least comparable. You can also see one of the plans we drew up for this level, which for the most part is still fairly accurate to the release version. In fact, this is one of the only levels where the design didn't drastically change, and while the general design translated to the new FPS format okay, the level wasn't without its own issues, as we explore in some of the upcoming commentary.
For a long time, the flashlight was an oil hand lantern that illuminated the area around the player. But later in development, this was changed to be an electrical lantern that used these big battery packs scattered around the world instead of oil cans. During playtests, quite a few people missed the flashlight, which back then was located on wooden crates next to where the missing valve was. So we decided to place the flashlight on the ground in hope people wouldn't miss it. Unfortunately, some players still did, so we went a step further and decided to force pick up the lantern when walking over it, with a pretty large radius. This was not an elegant solution, but it was necessary for later areas in the game with little to no light available. We also added a rat.
We knew that we wanted a counterpart for Nora, someone leading her through this desolate and lonely world. Definitely inspired by Father Gregory from Half-Life 2, Brent was born, a stubborn old man living alone in the ruins of his town, stuck in a wheelchair. This is sadly the only time you see him in person. We did not have the skills yet to let him appear more in a believable way, so we decided to keep his character voice only for the rest of the game. In future entries of the Industria IP, we see ourselves more in a position of having eye-to-eye conversations. Playdead's Limbo did a great job of showing human characters only very rarely, but just enough to make you believe that they actually had humans in the game. This inspired us to align our skills with a more simple storytelling method.
The chemistry puzzle was a challenge that we had to tackle time and time again. As our core loop changed, so too did our puzzle design, and in some cases they had to be redesigned from the ground up. Couple this with the tweaks in the play space, and this puzzle itself went through many different versions of its own. In fact, many of our puzzles in their first drafts suffered from displaying the solution before the obstacle, and so players would solve a puzzle before even knowing they were doing so. This is one of the reasons why we locked the door beneath Brent's cutscene, but it also helps us to pace the scene so that players stop to listen to him speak. With this new door locked, players now walk down the corridor, are met with Brent and the locked door, and are now aware of the puzzle to solve. Sounds simple, but for some reason it kept tripping us up early on. Since then, we now approach puzzles by showing players the problem first, and then provide potential ways to solve it. We also include fail states along the way. In terms of the chemistry puzzle, most iterations didn't even include fail states, and so it felt less like a puzzle and more like jumping hoops. Now, with the Glassatron in place, players can actively fail the puzzle until they take the time to understand it.
The Steam machines were already around in early builds, just weeks after production started in early 2017. Back then, the game was a lot more themed around steampunk and mechanical machinery. Even though the game's focus shifted, they remained as silent reminders of a different time, both in terms of the game's development, but also narrative-wise, as they were discarded when the new silent energy was introduced by Rosendahl. The stairwell, directly modeled after one of my favorite scenes from the original Blade Runner, which in turn was shot in the Bradbury building in Los Angeles. Something about the green railings and tight courtyard-like structure with open roof just fit perfectly into this part of the Institute. The planned swarm of birds bathing in the bottom of the stairwell sadly did not make it into the final scene.
As previously mentioned, the game was not originally an FPS, and switching core mechanics drastically changed the challenges we face as developers, as well as the expectations of the players. A retro survival horror is commonplace among the indie scene, and less so is a first-person shooter. Add to that our limited budget and capacity, and we soon found ourselves out of our depth. Despite having specifically set out 2 years prior with a proactive stance on feature creep, we were now at its mercy. Any existing systems had to be altered to fit the new perspective and genre, starting with fundamentals like controls and core loop, but also to include more complex topics like UX and narrative. When the camera is fixed, for example, we opted to use tank controls, but now required a new movement system and interaction system. Additionally, our approach to storytelling, using defined camera angles and controlled shots, now meant we had to tackle the narrative in a different way entirely. We also had to redesign some of the areas to suit, and this meant new assets and materials. With each new asset, new standards would emerge, making our other assets stand out. Eventually, we had to take a step back and redefine our gameplay and art style as a complete package once again.
An angel falling from the sky.
The design of the library is based on the State Library of Berlin, or rather Staatsbibliothek Berlin. In one of my favorite films, Wings of Desire or Der Himmel über Berlin by Wim Wenders, there are these rather abstract scenes shot in the State Library of Berlin. Something about the atmosphere, whispering voices and the portrayal of the library as this temple of knowledge made it fit perfectly to the narrative of Industria, which is loosely based on the book The Library of Babel by Arthur Borges. Originally designed by the architect Hans Scharoun, the building inherits a strong brutalist flavor some players connected to Remedy's Control, which is rather a coincidence. Great game, by the way. The library is the home of the librarians, the giants the player sometimes sees wandering through Horkevik. They have absolute knowledge and are the watchers of time and space itself. Therefore, a library could not fit more as their home.
The library, which we also call the super level. It's an abstract place at the end of each major level in the game. Whispering voices tell aware players backstories about the citizens of Horkevik and how they feel about certain events happening in their hometown. This level was really only made because of the theatre scenes, which follow directly after the library environments. The theatre scenes themselves were originally just simple cutscenes. However, we were unsatisfied with them being the only unplayable thing of Industria, so we made the theatre scenes playable. This was followed by us wanting to make players see and feel the library, the parallel world in which the theatres exist. One thing led to another, and suddenly we had a completely new environment complex.
The music in the library is kept rather abstract. I composed all library tracks with the difference between the normal and the parallel world in mind. The goal was a strong contrast to the other levels. As each library part stands for a certain part of the narrative, the music had to go through a change each time too. Going from rather mystery to light ambient sounds to dark and more threatening drones did a pretty good job. The theater music after each library part is always the same music track but altered with various filters to have a consistent music base while also differentiating between the two worlds.
Theatre acts as an abstract storytelling device at the end of each library part. The content of the play either preludes what's going to happen next, or it recaps what's already happened before, all during the time dilation. The idea was to create a simple theatre play with the main characters. Nora, for example, is portrayed as this constant hovering element, standing for her being essentially in stasis in the library. We wanted to give players the chance to walk by the show and not force them to watch the play. Looking back at it, this really just led to most players skipping the rooms, which led to losing momentum in the narrative. The theatre is another example of us adjusting the game's content to our skill level. We wanted to show actual human characters in the game, but knew that face-to-face conversations and close proximity would not be up to our standards. Facial modelling and animation, hair movement and eyes are all hard things to get right for us indies, without any experience in game making especially. Having human characters perform abstract plays at a distance the player can't physically reach was the perfect solution.
Welcome to Hockavik. Well, not really, but Half-Life 2 City 17 was definitely our starting point when we sat down to make Industria a reality all these years ago. The streets level, but also especially this area, the Institute Plaza, was one of the hardest to get right. The first version of this level was pretty far into development when we completely scrapped it, as its size and proportions were absolutely getting out of hand. And it was only then that we started to fundamentally change the layout of the streets multiple times. And it was this level which we showed to playtesters in late summer 2019 in our Alpha 2 via itch.io. This alpha nearly killed the project, as we realized how big this game really was. For 24 hours, Industria was cancelled after 2 years of relentless work. We were so exhausted and frustrated from the amount of bugs and work ahead that we really thought that was it.
Luckily, we kept going and changed the streets one last time. We began by compiling our critique from the alpha and defining our new focus with an up-to-date outlook on our game's design. At its core, this level is about reaching the town hall, and so we wanted to make that a landmark of the level. Hence, even at the start, we used composition again to construct important information on screen and have the town hall visible straight away in the top left. If you compare this with the old map, the town hall was totally irrelevant, as players would not even be aware of it until they reached it. This one piece of composition takes the level from aimlessly stumbling through linear corridors to moving through the city with purpose and enjoyment as you repeatedly see the approach from multiple locations.
Hockavik's architecture is heavily inspired by Berlin's Wilhelminian architecture from the 1900s. As I grew up in buildings like those, authenticity was one of the most important things for us. Half-Life 2 City 17 was a major influence for us to lean more into European architecture in the first place. When the narrative moved into a German and Berlin setting, it came natural that we had to dive deeper into apartments similar to those I spent my childhood in. Tall structures, beautiful patina, metal gutters, wooden doors, wooden floors, old post boxes, tight corridors and the iconic double windows. Looking back at the game nowadays, a lot more could have been done with the interiors. Things we will keep in mind for more games set in this universe. Having the Wilhelminian architecture as a base, let's introduce the next layer. Atlas technology. Thick black cables and metal tanks filled with an unknown liquid sitting on the beautiful facades like parasites. We really wanted to give players the feeling that Atlas took what it needed. The combine of Half-Life and the general design of Dishonored often subconsciously influenced us to go for the absolute clash of feelings. The familiar and the unfamiliar, merging into something new.
Industria is definitely a mysterious world, not much life to be found here. The absence of human life and its natural chaos made the sound design a big task. A lot of thought went into the design process of the soundscapes. We had to make sure that we put as much detail in it as possible, but without compromising the bleakness of this world. If you move around here, you will find different cues of randomly stressing materials like wood and metal, or you will find water dropping on different material types. In the outside areas you will find rocks and pebbles falling off of structures or small wind gushes in the trees. Take some time, go around and just listen.
There's two main categories for game animation, which is our cinematics and our combat animations. The cinematics need to push the story forward, but we have a little bit more freedom with how they play out, how much time we spend in them, and what we can do. The combat animations are a bit trickier because you want them to look good, but you need them to feel good when you're playing. And sometimes what looks good on its own doesn't end up feeling good when you're playing the game. So there's a lot of back and forth with the team. I think my favorite animation note from Dave and Steve was for the theater scenes. They said, "We want it to look like a bad play. Make it stiff and awkward."
The whole game went through countless narrative changes, including the role of Walter and Rosendahl. Initially, Walter was named Hugo and brother of Nora, which later in development was organically tailored to a more interesting relationship between two people working on the same project. But also the role of Rosendahl, King of Hogwick, changed many times. Originally, Rosendahl was not Walter, but his own character, sole survivor of the robot invasion, ruling over a destroyed city, completely alone. This aspect was transformed into Brent, and the rather quirky and cheeky King Rosendahl, very much inspired by Paul II's Cave Johnson, was transformed into Walter himself. This way, we had a much more personal connection between him and Nora, as well as a stronger connection between him and the people of Hogwick.
The factory was thought to be a much busier place, and we had imagined it to be darker and more frightening. Featuring an Atlas assembly line, the player would have seen robots being manufactured, and would have featured multiple stages of their production process, revealing more of the backstory about the AI. This is just another one of those things that we didn't manage to pull off in time though, so instead we replaced this area with some downtime between the Rosendahl Plaza fights and the upcoming fight where Nora battles her way up to the town hall. We have much more to show when it comes to Atlas though, so the original concept of this environment will definitely be explored in future installments.
This area was part of the last Steam Next Fest before release in summer 2021. It ranged from after the factory to the town hall entrance and therefore needed a good pacing and ramp up from calmness to action and back to calmness. The format of the demo forced us to make the sequence of fighting your way up to the town hall one perfectly paced scene. We staged multiple enemy spawns the closer you get to the town hall and implemented combat music as well. The combat ends on a high with fighting multiple ranged enemies on the steps, followed by absolute peace when watching a librarian walking on the horizon, accompanied by calm analog music. Looking back at it, it's probably one of the most polished scenes in this level, with good pacing, nearly no bugs and a wonderful start and end point. The demo forced us to get our concept right, and endless feedback from our community beforehand helped us to nail the scene as a whole. This shows how helpful a demo can be, as it forces the developers to really finish an area and not leave it at 90%. Ideally, demo builds like the Steam Next Fest are part of the development pipeline from the ground up. This is really something we learned a lot about and will certainly make use of in our next project.
The combat music for Industria was a challenge. On the one hand, Industria has intense fight scenes where we wanted to support the action with intense combat tracks. On the other hand, Industria is not purely focused on fighting, so rather cinematic combat music felt wrong in the context. Experiments with constantly present combat music showed us that with all the fight scenes in the game, the balance between combat and non-combat music would be disrupted. In the end, we mostly went for no music in the fight scenes, giving the gun sounds and enemy shouts more room to breathe. This led the music only being present in rather calm moments. Looking back at it, we feel like having some sort of combat music dynamically changing to the fight through software like Fmod would have been a good way as well, the direction we want to pursue in future titles for sure.
For the animated first-person cutscenes, we used both the first-person rig and the full-body rig. The reason as to why we chose this confusing combinations throughout the game is because of our deadline, the release of Industria closing in faster than anticipated. We had to decide to continue using the first-person rig going forward after the initial wake-up animation in Nora's apartment, as it took less time to just animate hands than a full-body character. Even though it was decided to only use the first-person hand rig for the wake-up animations in the library, I insisted on using the full-body rig there as well, to really place the player into this very surreal environment.
The soundtrack of Industria is more pop and ambient music than cinematic, and this was a deliberate choice we made very early in development. This led to a few tracks having vocals which we really liked in the context of a narrative and emotional game like Industria. However, in the end, only 2 tracks actually feature lyrics. These lyrics, though, often hold some foreshadowing on the narrative events. The track playing here when descending from the town hall, for example, features lyrics about the place where the rails end, where you'll find peace, a hint to the forest and Walter being there.
For Industria, I actually recorded a lot of Foleys. 3 things specifically were very time consuming to create, but worth every hour of work that was put in it. Those would be custom footsteps, bullet impacts, and the bullet casings hitting the floor. This also means having a sound for each physical surface material available in the engine. This included stone, wood, metal, grass, water, and a few more. Each of those sounds needs enough variance so the human ear doesn't get bored or even annoyed by the repeating sounds. For the footsteps alone, we ended up with something around 500 assets. For the bullet impacts, I used screw nuts and smashed them against different materials, and for the bullet casings, I actually bought different types of empty brass casings and let them fall onto different floor materials.
It's crazy how much stuff we built for Industria that didn't make it to the finished game. With every build, we're trying to figure out what's serving the game's purpose and what isn't. In the last year of development, we scrapped about 4 of our established enemy designs and all of their animations, and designed 3 new robots. We wanted the designs to be rooted in a practical purpose, something other than just killing our players. The Prophet, one of our melee characters, has these crazy surgical arms that move every which way, so its purpose is medical care. The Optic, our ranged character, was policing or a defense unit for the city. The Hound's a type of resource gathering, they have circular saws in their face, maybe they cut down trees or help construct buildings. I don't know. The saws are just kind of cool.
The steam train was always part of the game and was included from the beginning in some form or another. Having Half-Life 2 as an inspiration, we knew we didn't want cuts which break the player's feeling of time and space. We wanted an uninterrupted journey. But with a whole city to explore and the concept of leaving it, we knew making the journey on foot would only bring us so far. We needed a vehicle, and given the much more steampunk direction we used to have in mind for Industria, it came natural to us to pick a steam train. This concept worked out pretty well in the end, though like many things in the game we imagined the train to be a little more complex. At some points we had carriages fully modelled out and working, acting as some sort of base for the player. Here, players would have restocked ammo and health, as well as looking at a big map of the area they are traversing. This would have needed a lot more time in the oven though to fully make sense. Also, the concept of a moving base felt more and more unnecessary in the context of a linear narrative FPS, which had set its focus on different things over the years. In regards to the library, we didn't really succeed in creating a satisfying narrative. One of the things kept in secret is the fact that Nora spends the time dilation Brent tells her about in the library. In fact, each part represents a few years of her existence in the void. We tried to communicate this by having different wake-up animations and locations at the start of each part. The falling librarians contemplate the narrative development of the city and the world being overrun by Atlas robots. The library is a dying place and the librarians are suffering from Atlas spreading into their home. This is the base for all parallel dimensions to ever exist.
Sand, water and wood. In case you haven't caught it yet, Steve and I are both massive fans of Valve's work in general, but specifically the environments of Half-Life 2. One rather large part of Half-Life 2 is Highway 17, a long journey with a car on a coastal road with nothing but seagulls, the water rushing in from the sea, and sand. Okay, and loads of antlions. Anyway, this and our love for coastal areas in general, specifically the Baltic Sea I spent a lot of time at in my childhood, led us to organically explore coastal environments in Industria as well. There is something very special about dry wood, sun, sand, salt water and the laughter of seagulls. We can't exactly put our fingers on it, but we created such an environment with the canal anyway. We hope our weird love for coastal scenes comes through and you feel a little bit of the calming feeling of solitude and peace we felt when we explored the beach of Highway 17 back in the late 2000s, in a game which will probably always stay in our hearts.
For the weapons, we used the pistol as our animation testing grounds. It was basically the groundwork for all of our first-person weapons you see in the final product, both in code and in animation sequences. Before I came in, Dave tried his best to animate all of the weapons himself, but he was super glad to give this task to me. The only animations that were there before I joined the team were simple idle, shooting, reloading, lowering and racing animations for the weapons. We expanded on the system by adding movement animations such as walking, running and jumping, which added a lot more spatial awareness to the character you're playing as. Another thing that made quite a difference was adding custom animations when no weapons are selected. When holstering your weapons, or when you simply have not found any yet, you can see Nora's hands moving while sprinting. This really helped to ground Nora more into the world, as well as giving a more intense feeling of speed when sprinting through the environments.
We always knew that we needed a climax at the last level inside the city, as leaving was supposed to be the relief of finally escaping from all the chaos. Having the combat climax originally in the gate level, which unfortunately had to be cut, we moved the action climax into the canal, more specifically into these dark underground areas. This was supposed to be Industria's Ravenholm, a dark, spooky area filled with enemies and challenging the player's abilities. This scene of chaos starts with Nora falling down a bridge, and with that she is cut off from Brent even further. Then we include a more challenging combat sequence, followed by an emotional high when Nora escapes the underground and makes her way towards the peaceful rooftops of Brent's apartment building. The difficulty curve did not really manage to climax here though, and so this section felt more like a midpoint than it did nearing an end. This ultimately leads to confusion about the abrupt ending, which we actually tried to counter with this combat climax in the underground. Our efforts were somewhat in vain though, as we then offset this climax with the final visit to the library and the inclusion of the forest level before reaching the end at the chapel. We learned a huge lesson about combat and narrative pacing in this part of the game, and hope not to repeat this problem in future. Nevertheless, we still feel the darker and more scary underground acts beautifully as a stark contrast to the narrative beats unfolding at Brent's rooftop.
One of the main problems we are very aware of is the not very realistic occlusion effect in the game. Occlusion means sounds behind walls and bigger obstacles are muffled but still audible. This effect is not very realistic in the game due to our missing knowledge on how to technically realize it, and in the end also our tight time plan for releasing this game. What we ended up with are dozens of audio volumes for each level. These define areas in the game, mostly fitting to single rooms. What they do is muffle sounds outside their area, apply reverbs to sounds within that area, and other things like that. But with more complicated structures it gets hard making those audio volumes working efficiently. One of the biggest problems are dynamic objects like doors. With our next title we are definitely planning on improving on that matter and making auditive realism even more possible.
The greenhouses were always supposed to be a peaceful moment between all the chaos which unfolds around Nora. A moment of breathing, and just enjoying the warmth of the sun and the view of the city of Horkovik below. This was just the perfect place for Brent and his wife's story, a story about loss and loneliness, but also warmth and love. Then after Nora takes the picture for Brent, she has to go back down into the abyss and into the danger, back into Atlas's world and her own search for Walter.
The side quest of Brent and his photo was added pretty late to the game. The plot and ultimately the city of Hakavik felt a little empty. We wanted a very direct communication with someone, emotional responses and actions with consequences. The canal level had no big plot yet defined, other than having a combat peak at the end and a big gate. The gate was once separated from the canal in its own level, which we sadly had to cut due to time constraints. It was there where plot-wise Brent would appear and help Nora to escape. We realized that the emotional bond between Brent and Nora was not strong enough to make the player really care about him potentially getting hurt. The photo side quest was the perfect way to forge a stronger connection between them and show some weakness to Brent as well, developing him from being a grumpy old man to a fragile, emotional being.
Let's also talk about some issues with the music in Industria. Looking back at it, we realized that often the music does not have the space it would need. This has to do with the track style of the music and its implementation. The kind of setup needs space in the level design to breathe, and we underestimated what it means to plan this space early in blockouts. Apart from the not so perfect placement, the music is often rather complex because of its musical genre. This complexity also needs space to really shine. These are two fundamental problems with the implementation of the music in Industria, which we, although being very happy with the music itself, will not repeat in future titles.
When I read The Library of Babel by Jorge Luis Borges back in 2016, I was immediately fascinated by the concept. A library with an immense amount of books, which hold all possible combinations of the 24 letters of the Latin alphabet, resulting in everything ever written or said, all available in the library, including your biography and this audio commentary. When we made Industria and ideas started to float around how our parallel dimension fiction could work, I remembered the concept and we thought, what if instead of letters, we combine physical matter in all possible combinations, leading to a nearly endless sea of possible parallel dimensions. This was the start of the library in Industria. We did not have the resources to fully explore this concept, but would love to do so in future installments of the IP. The Forest, the last level of Industria. Retrospectively, we learned that many players were disappointed that the game ended that quickly. This is an issue deeply injected into the game's DNA. Frankly, Industria overwhelmed us more and more when approaching the release date in September 21. Way too late did we design the end of the game, and therefore, way too late did we test people's reactions on a narrative end. We underestimated narrative game testing in general and focused a lot on bug finding instead of testing if players even liked the end of the game. Nevertheless, we are happy with the peaceful ending, arriving outside the city where Walter is supposed to be. We deliberately cut all combat in this level to calm the player down and focus on our single goal, find Walter. A peaceful forest and visual connection to the first level, the office, seemed to be the best solution to end this adventure.
The simple interaction with the grave was added pretty last minute, but had quite a big impact on players. Some did simply oversee it, but to our surprise we found many players really enjoyed it, especially when the game feeds back to the player using the radio. This taught us a lot about interactivity and connection with the narrative. Frictional Games' Soma did a great job evoking similar feelings of power and meaning with optional interactions such as these. We definitely want to explore these kinds of scenes more in future titles. We've reached the end of the game, and with that the end of the developer commentary. Thank you for taking the time to listen along, and we hope this gave you some insight behind some of our challenges and design decisions. Industria was our first game and a gigantic challenge in all aspects. We're well aware of its imperfections, but we're also very proud of this beautiful monstrosity we made in 5 years of our lives, next to work and university.
We thank everyone for the support and hope you enjoyed Industria despite its issues, and hope you saw what kept us going and why we poured all our heart and soul into it. Creating an atmospheric and immersive world, tickling your imagination on an auditory and visual level. Thank you from the whole team at Bleak Mill, and we hope to see you playing our next title.